How's that?
Yeah, we can see.
Great.
So one more thing I want to let you know that people in this meeting are like by default like muted and cannot they just only chat with their questions. So if they find any questions in between your presentation, so they will mention as a chat, or if they can also raise their hand, so I will make them unmutable so they can ask questions with you directly.
Sure. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, so I think we are on the time, and let me kick this off. So good morning everyone, and welcome to the new session of Sitecore User Group Jaipur. And in today's session, we want to introduce Jeffrey Rondeau, who will be presenting today with this topic. So Jeffrey is currently working as a manager of engineering, digital experience, and having a great experience in Sitecore. He's a Sitecore technology MVP and also a Covio MVP. So I'm going to hand over this session to him, and I think you can start now.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks everyone for taking the time this, I guess, evening to join. Um, yeah, like he mentioned, my name is Jeffrey Rondeau. I'm a manager of engineering here at Merkle. And today I want to talk with you a little bit about some of the experience that we had implementing Experience Edge at scale in the context of Sitecore's, composable stack. So about me pretty much summed it up already, but um, I've been with Merkle for about 9 years now. Started off doing just Sitecore development, did architecture for a while, and now have since moved into the quote unquote dark side as a manager. And let me actually let me go on camera so you all can see me. But yeah, 4-time Sitecore MVP, Coveo MVP. And also, if you ever happen to see me in person, two of the things that I really love are whiskey, and I also really love dogs. So those are the two quickest things you can mention to start up a conversation with me. But enough about me. What are we going to be talking about today? So for you, what are you going to walk away with? Um, First thing is, I just want to talk about Jamstack a little bit. As Sitecore developers, it's it's kind of hit and miss on how much everyone knows about Jamstack. So I'm going to give you just a brief history of it, describe what it is to kind of set the foundation. Then, talking about how Experience Edge and Sitecore as a whole kind of fits into the Jamstack architecture and that approach, that way of doing things. And then finally, the kind of meat of all this is going to be implementation lessons learned from implementing Experience Edge. So we were fortunate enough to be one of the first partners in the world to implement Experience Edge. And then finally, how does this story end? So we implemented Experience Edge, and how did our solution perform? Everything go as expected? What would we do differently? How is everything looking today? Okay, so with that, let's talk a little bit about Jamstack. So what is it? Well, as I was putting together this presentation and doing a little bit more research into Jamstack itself, the first thing that I noticed is that it's actually been around a lot longer than at least a lot of people, and I would say myself as well, thought it had. So it actually really came to life back in 2015. Um, so nearly 7 years ago now, almost 8. So there were static site generators or SSGs. Um, there was one called Jekyll, which was, I believe, a Ruby gem at the time. And static sites are just now starting to become popular in 2015, in 2016. The term Jamstack actually starts to come to life nearly 7 or 8 years ago now. There's an excellent talk. I forget the gentleman who gave it, but if you go to, I think, just jamstack.org, it's really the initial talk about his way of doing things and this approach that him and his company were taking on a project, and that was really one of the origins of Jamstack itself. So now in 2017, we have the modern web revolution starting to prioritize the importance of things like performance, scalability, developer performance. And Jamstack is now starting to gain a wider adoption in the industry. Then 2018, we've got some tools that might look a little familiar to us. So we've got Netlify, we have Gatsby coming on, we have Contentful. These things are created and the community really starts to embrace them and rapidly grow. And also in 2018, we have the first ever Jamstack conference. Then in 2019, continues to grow even more. We've got new tools, we have new services. This is when I think a lot of people started hearing about Jamstack more and more mainstream. And then in 2020, so only just a couple of years ago now, I always find this part a little interesting. So Jamstack with a capital JAM actually because becomes just Jamstack without the capital A and the M. Uh, so slight spelling tweak. But Vercel is introduced and Next.js really surges in popularity. So we're seeing more of these tools and technologies and frameworks that we use. A lot of us use every day now and are very prevalent in the industry. And of course, from 2020 onward, we've seen it only grow even more. If any of you were at Sitecore Symposium, or maybe you watched or heard about any of the sessions, you've heard quite a bit, I'm sure, about Jamstack and Next.js and Sitecore's own strategic partnership with Vercel as well. Okay, so that's great, but cool history lesson, but what actually is Jamstack? So Jamstack, the J, the A, and the M stands for JavaScript, APIs, and markup. So you have JavaScript, which is enabling all of the dynamic aspects of your website. And now you're not tied to a monolithic framework or whatever backend technologies you're using. So the front end can um, use completely separate tooling, separate languages, whatever it wants to do, and just and your backend team can do the same thing as well. The A for APIs, so your third party or your typical server side functionality is called by your JavaScript now over HTTPS. So if you want to maybe update a contact in your CRM or you want to send an email, instead of doing, like a postback where you would process that in an MVC controller, um, there's just an API call that gets made on the front end, and you're either directly calling a third party, or if you have a custom API or a custom middleware and you want to call that custom C# code or quite frankly, whatever language you want, you can do that and to do that server-side functionality. And then finally, you've got markup, right? Because if we're making a website, we need some HTML to actually view and make things presentable to a customer. So one of the things you often see in Jamstack, you don't always see it, but it is very frequent, is that websites are generated as static files using SSGs or static site generators. And the reason for that, which we'll talk about here in just a second, is primarily speed, but there are a lot of other benefits to it as well. So some of the common attributes and benefits of Jamstack. The first, which I touched on just a moment ago, is decoupling your front end and your back end. So no longer as a front end developer are you tied to using the same tech stack and technologies as your back end teams, which is really great. So your front end can focus on front end stuff and they don't have to worry about things as much on the back end. So your front end is often built using static site generators, and your back end is integrated into the process using APIs during either your build process when the site is being generated. That's what the build process is referred to. Or at runtime, where something happens, the user takes an action, and an API is called. Static first. So often sites, like I mentioned, they're pre-rendered statically with your dynamic elements being powered by client-side JavaScript. So there are going to be times where you can't pre-generate every single thing. So you can still render those dynamic elements with client-side JavaScript, but something that doesn't change very often and doesn't rely maybe on user input or user context, those things can be statically generated, which gives you incredible speed. They're also progressively enhanced, so your JavaScript can be introduced as needed to increase your performance on the browser. Um, but since we're statically generating all of these things, right? At the end of the day, if you really boil it down, you're essentially serving a generated HTML page um, over a CDN because they have to live somewhere. And you could have them live anywhere you want, but a lot of people have them live on platforms like Azure and Vercel and places like that. But if you think about it, if you have a flat HTML page and you're just serving it over a CDN, that's going to be incredibly fast because you're taking all of the work that would normally happen when a user navigates to your page. And for us on the Sitecore side, what we're used to is going through the HTTP request begin pipeline and going through rendering all of our components. All of that work, all of that time happens up front um, during the build process. So by the time me, let's say as a customer, navigates to the page, all of that doesn't have to happen, and I can just serve up a page that is already generated. One of the other reasons that performance is becoming such a focus is because that we as customers have such high expectations now on how fast things should be, right? Almost kind of like the Netflix or the Amazon effect, where if you're building a website, it has to be quick because we as customers are so used to the experiences given to us by those large, powerful software vendors that we expect that just across the board. For example, if you look at Amazon, for instance, and let's say they're, I'm on their site and their search or their site just takes 1 second longer than it normally would, just 1 second. Um, that would equate to $1.6 billion in lost sales for them, just because it's 1 second slower. Or for Google, same situation. It would cost them 20 million lost searches a year. So the cost of just a single second can be huge. Granted, not all of us work at Amazons and Googles and Microsofts, but for even our own customers, right, that can be a huge cost. They're also more secure. So if you think about it, during the build process, if a lot of that work is happening and we're just serving up static content, um, our attack surface area shrinks down quite a bit. There's not as many opportunities for threats, but of course, threats still exist. Expensive, often less so. So all of us are Sitecore developers, right? So nothing will probably ever be free. But it could get to the point where if you're using Jamstack without Sitecore involved and you're just serving up static pages, you could serve that over a free infrastructure and you could probably not have to pay a thing. Your developer experience really levels up here as well. So again, because of that decoupling, I think it reduces a lot of friction in your own development process. So your front end can focus on the front end without those monolithic architecture ties, which in my experience, they really, really like. And then finally, scalability. So if you have a CDN in front that's serving static content, that CDN can just adjust to spikes in traffic. And it's really easy to serve static content really quickly anyway. So you don't have to worry nearly as much about scaling up or down or checking servers or any of those types of things. And that's all, really great. But I want to bring everyone kind of back to reality. So while all of these things were happening in the front end world, what were all of us primarily doing in the world of Sitecore during the past 5-6 years? We were doing MVC and Razor. We had content delivery servers. We had content management servers. We have Solar. We have XDB. We've got SQL. We have marketing automation. We have a CDN. Maybe you have Cortex in there too. There's so much. Maybe you've got Universal Tracker. We have so much stuff going on, and it wasn't anything that we just talked about, right? So the front end was tied to the back end. Um, we weren't statically generating anything at all. We had to worry about scaling up servers, scaling down, where the server's located. We had all of these complex concerns as Sitecore developers, and a lot of us, depending on where we're at in or what project we're working on, still have these same kinds of concerns. But at least for me, right, I saw these things happening in the industry, but I was stuck doing different kinds of work, and it kind of made me feel like this a little bit, where I was Squidward and I was just watching all the other Jamstack people having fun, but I was just not doing any of that work. But of course, it didn't stay that way for long, right? Because we know that Sitecore has headless services, or as they used to call it, JSS. So this was a huge change in for Sitecore. They were one of the first major DXP providers to start embracing headless. They're really at the forefront of that. So what did that mean? Well, the biggest and largest adjustment I think that we all felt as Sitecore developers, right, was no more MVC. So no more Razor views, no more controller renderings and things like that. The world that we had known for so long, right, it was drastically different now. So instead, Sitecore really starts to begin to function essentially like an API server, where it's serving up content, it's serving out layout data, and then the front end just decides what they want to do with it. And they do that through a set of either REST or GraphQL endpoints. And a lot of people, have a .NET background that are Sitecore developers, and there's still a .NET Core rendering SDK that they kept around. It's still here today. But they also introduced JavaScript rendering SDKs for languages like React and Vue and Angular, and to support frameworks like Next.js as well, which is great. But at least in my opinion, and I'll be the first to say I'm no infrastructure expert by any means, but I found that the infrastructure for JSS could still be at least a little bit complex. An example of that is this, and this is taken from Sitecore's own website, right? So if I'm a visitor on the right and I want to just view my page, um, great. So I can hit my button to request it. That goes to my node load balancer, which behind the scenes, if I'm doing SSR or server-side rendering, um, I route through these node SSR proxies, which then routes to my CD load balancer, because I still have Sitecore CD servers in the mix to send that content out. And then that CD load balancer routes to one of any of my Sitecore content delivery servers. And then we come all the way back, and that app HTML gets sent to the browser, which gets sent back to me as a visitor. So there's a lot going on there, and keep in mind this is just to render an HTML page, right? I could just be doing a marketing landing page, right? And there's all of this work and all of this infrastructure needed to do something pretty simple. So I still found it a little complex and at times a little confusing. But we're still doing headless, right? We're still in that future of modern web development. And for me and my front end teams, this is how we felt, at least for a little bit of time. They could do their thing, they could do headless, and all was good, and we felt like we were best friends. But of course, we all know that Sitecore wasn't done. So now we have this thing called Experience Edge that came around maybe maybe year and a half, 2 years ago now. Um, and that changed things quite a bit, but it changed things for the better. So let's just set the stage. What is Experience Edge? And you have to give me a moment. It's 6 in the morning for me, so I did make myself a cup of coffee. All right. So what is Experience Edge? So the first thing to note is that it's a SaaS offering. And if you've seen the announcements from Symposium or had the opportunity to be there yourself, you'll know that Sitecore is going all in on SaaS, and they're going all in on composable, headless, Jamstack. That's really where they're going. So Experience Edge, when it got announced a few years ago, was just part of that and moving them and setting them up to do that. So it's a SaaS offering from Sitecore. And what it does is it gives you globally replicated, scalable access to your items, your layout, and your media. So how I like to think of it is that Experience Edge is essentially a content delivery network or a CDN for your Sitecore content and your media. And the media part shouldn't be underplayed. And I'll come back to why that shouldn't be underplayed here in a moment. But the reason it's able to do this and perform and function as a CDN is because it's a cached snapshot of your layout service with your media library assets as well. So in reality, it's just a Sitecore hosted GraphQL API. That's all it is. And what that does is it enables you to now power any device anywhere at any time. So a lot of us build websites. That's what we do when Sitecore is involved a lot of the time. But with Experience Edge, it doesn't have to just be websites. You can power native mobile apps, which is something that we'll actually showcase here in a little bit. But you can power in-store kiosks, you can do smartwatches, you can do anything, any application that can make calls and understand GraphQL. Um, you can use Sitecore content and you can use Experience Edge, which is really, really cool. But it also removes infrastructure complexity. So I talked a moment ago about what the infrastructure could sometimes look like for a Sitecore JSS implementation before Edge was introduced, where we had node proxy servers, we still had content delivery servers in the mix that were ultimately delivering our Sitecore content at the end of the day. But with Experience Edge, that all goes away. So I don't know if any of you, I'm sure you um, have maybe gotten a call from a project manager or a client or support that's like, hey man, the load on the content delivery server is really high. The CPU is pegged at 90% and the database is at 100%. Do we need more servers? Do we need to add more resources? What do we do? Maybe it's 4 a.m. Those aren't fun conversations to have. And at least for me personally, that wasn't a big fan. I wasn't a big fan of spending my time doing that, like worrying about how many servers I needed and if they were in all the right regions, if I needed to, serve someone in a different part of the world. Um, so all of that's gone now with Experience Edge. You have your content management server, and we'll show the architecture of Edge here in a moment. But essentially, you have your content management server, and instead of publishing to a delivery server, you're just publishing to Experience Edge, and that's it. From there, Edge is kind of like your new CD server in the sense that it's powering all of the content that needs, all the applications that need to consume that content. It's not doing any of the rendering anymore, but it's doing the job of content. So because that infrastructure complexity is removed, it enables your engineering teams to focus efforts elsewhere. So instead of worrying about things like scalability and CPU load and database and all that stuff, um, maybe instead, which we all know as Sitecore developers, most of our job is just picking the right icons in the content editor. Joking, but icons are important. It enables you to spend more time on other things. So maybe it's the content management experience and making the authoring process more easy and more straightforward for your users, or maybe it's doing work for another part of your business, or maybe it's making custom icons. Who knows, right? However you spend the time is up to you. And then finally, I do want to come back to the media side of things. So often in traditional implementations, it's typically a best practice, right, to have your media library assets served over a CDN to take some of that load off of your content delivery servers. Well, now with Experience Edge, you kind of get that for free. So you're killing two birds with one stone. You get your media library that's served over a CDN, and you also get your Sitecore content, which is pretty cool. And because of all of this, right, you have so much room for activities, and you have so much extra time on your hands to do other and probably more important things. So the architecture of Experience Edge. So we'll go from the bottom to the top. So on the bottom, the content management server. Nothing changes here. It's the same CM server that we all know and love. But on top of it, there's an Experience Edge connector, which is a package that you just install like anything else. And what that does is that it enables you to send content to the Experience Edge delivery platform. Or again, it's just a GraphQL hosted API that Sitecore provides because it's a SaaS product. So when you hit publish, and you get the familiar dialog and the little spinner, what that's doing is sending and capturing a snapshot of your layout service, or what I'd like to kind of think of it as is your legacy presentation details, what those look like, and sending them to Experience Edge. So it's cached, sends it to Edge, Edge has it along with your media, and now anything can call into it using GraphQL. So you can send your items and layout data to your front end. You can do that either at build time when it's statically generating your site, if you choose to implement it that way, or you can use it at runtime. Maybe there's a content request that needs to get made dynamically on the fly. You can do that too. And all of that is over GraphQL, which is pretty cool. And that can be a client browser at the other end. But like I mentioned, it doesn't have to be a website. It could be anything. It could be a mobile app, watch, whatever. It doesn't matter. All right. So now that we know what Jamstack is, talked a little bit about the history and how it's evolved over time, talked about how Sitecore is now stepping into Jamstack, stepping into the composable world with things like Sitecore JSS or headless services, and also talked about how Experience Edge is now in the picture and how that feeds into composable and Jamstack. Let's talk a little bit about a real life example of what this looked like when we implemented it a little bit ago. So first, I want to put the project that we were working in context, right? So before we got started, our customer already had Sitecore. They had an existing MVC application, and they also had Xamarin solutions as well. So they had mobile apps running, and they were using Xamarin for those. Now, this company in particular was a restaurant holding company. So they own 7 different restaurant brands, and each one of those 7 brands has a website and it has a mobile app. And they were all 7 of those brands were on different disparate technology stacks. So what they wanted was to unify all of that. So there doesn't, if you think about it from the side of the business, if I build a checkout page for one restaurant, I don't need to rebuild the same checkout process 6 other times, right? I can hopefully build it once and reuse it across their entire portfolio. So what we were looking at was 7 restaurant brands, each with a website, each with a mobile app, for a total of 14 websites and mobile apps, and they wanted to share content across all of them. And then for them, just again, for them as a business, literally hundreds of millions of dollars are going to go through the platform that we're building, because when people want to order food online, they're going to come to our site. Now we're not using Sitecore Commerce or anything like that, right? We're just using JSS, but it's going to be a significant portion of their business, right? Which I think is important just to note the importance behind it. Okay, so that's what we were walking into. So here is what our initial architecture looked like from a Jamstack point of view, and I'll go top down. So we've got GitHub as our source control provider. And then we'll look at Vercel. So Vercel and Next.js. Next.js was the framework that we chose to use to implement the front end of our site. And we chose to host the front end of our site on Vercel. So again, depending on how familiar you are with headless and with Composable, since Sitecore isn't doing the rendering anymore, there's no CD HTTP request begin pipeline that we're running all of our components through and doing controller renderings. The front end of the site has to be hosted somewhere. It has to live somewhere because we're headless. So Vercel is where it lives. That's where it's hosted at. Then it's not of too much importance here, but we do have a middleware platform, which, if you remember when we were talking about what Jamstack stood for, the API portion of that. So we needed something to call when we needed server-side functionalities. So the API platform was there, and it abstracted away all of our third-party calls to systems like Punch, Olo, and Cheetah. Those specific third parties, it really doesn't make a difference in the context of this example. And then at the bottom, we've got Sitecore. So we've got the CM server, and then at the beginning, we had 3 CD servers. And those CD servers were sending content out to our front end application at build time, and then also to the mobile apps that we were building using React Native, using GraphQL. And the fact that it was using GraphQL was really important, and I'll touch on why it was so important here in just a moment. So this was all well and good. We were using this, and things were fine. And then Sitecore announced Experience Edge. So this was all developed, and we were working on things. We hadn't launched yet, but we had the architecture, and we were working on it. And then Sitecore announced Experience Edge, which threw an interesting wrench into this, right? So how did we approach that? We had a lot of really long conversations with Sitecore and also with our client, and ultimately, surprise, surprise, adopted Experience Edge in the middle of our development. So we hadn't launched anything yet. We had our architecture, but we adopted Experience Edge in the middle of our work. But we did choose to keep our content delivery servers. The reason we did that was because whether it's Sitecore or whether it's any other software company, the first release of a brand new product probably isn't gonna work exactly how you expect it to all of the time. There are gonna be issues with it. And again, that doesn't matter if it's Sitecore or anyone else. There's risk there. There's risk for being an early adopter, and we knew that. So we wanted to keep our delivery servers just in case we needed them for some reason. Maybe Experience Edge doesn't work out how we were hoping it would, and we need to go back to the old, more tried and true way, if you will, of doing things. So we kept those servers around, and instead we implemented the ability to quickly toggle whether we're using Experience Edge when we're making calls. Are we calling Experience Edge? Or are we calling a delivery server? So we were able to implement that, and that way we can quickly switch between the two, again, if we needed to, right? So if something happened with Experience Edge and we were in the middle of development, we don't want to become blocked, so at least our teams could keep moving forward. So what did all of that look like? Well, you'll notice this diagram looks by and large the exact same as it did before. The only changes are in the Sitecore box down below. So the CD servers are still there. They're grayed out next to the CM server. But now instead of them, the CM server is publishing that content up to Experience Edge. And that's really abstracted away from all other parts of our architecture, because for Cell, doesn't care if it's getting the content from a CD or if it's getting it from Experience Edge. It's still using GraphQL, which is very important because we couldn't have done all of this if we were using REST. It's still using GraphQL, so it doesn't matter. And same thing for the mobile apps. The response is the exact same. So it enabled us to do that switching and do that abstraction successfully, which was huge. Experience Edge is great, don't get me wrong, but there are some limitations. And to Sitecore's credit, they document these very clearly on their website. And I have a link to some helpful resources where you can find this information at the end. So first thing, it only supports Solar as your search provider. By and large, not really an issue, but something to note. It doesn't support Sitecore personalization rules or content testing. It doesn't support dynamic or contextual output from the layout surface. Again, that's because what Experience Edge is, it's a cached snapshot of your layout surface. So you can't make the Experience Edge response dynamic and contextual based on user, based on personalization rules or things like that. Publishing a single item could result in publishing hundreds. I'm sure most of us are used to this to some extent. If you've ever had a content author say, "Why is it taking so long to publish? I published this key thing and I hit publish related items and I hit republish." I'm sure we've had those conversations before. But because of the way that publishing works in Experience Edge, which is slightly different than we're used to, because we're not just sending things from the master database to the web database anymore, um, it has to flatten that dependency tree a little bit. So publishers can take a little bit longer, and you could just be publishing one item, but in reality, you have to publish a lot because of dependencies. It also doesn't enforce security constraints. So if you don't want something to be accessible, you need to use publishing restrictions and workflow and things like that instead, so it doesn't get published to Edge. Because those rules, like your workflow rules, your publishing restrictions, those are still taken into account when you do a publish. And then it only supports the default device as well. Again, not a huge deal on some of these, but important to note. And these aren't all of the limitations, but these are some of the ones that I thought were particularly important. Some of our implementation lessons learned. The first one, which was more a problem at the beginning, we haven't seen it be as much of an issue lately, is Experience Edge caching can be a little problematic. So there were times where, let's say I'm on my home page and I'm editing just a title, right? Just doing a basic content change. I would make my change on the CM, I'd hit publish, I'd get the lovely dialogue with the spinner that says, updated this many items, created this many, deleted this many. You all know what I'm talking about, I'm sure. So naturally, as a developer or as a content author who's worked in Sitecore before, I go out to the front end of the site and I refresh, and I'm expecting to see my title update. But sometimes it never did. And we didn't have a lot of insight as to why. I would expect, right, that at the end of that dialogue where it tells me how much I updated, created, deleted, that my change was done. Edge was updated. But in reality, it wasn't yet updated. There were things that were happening behind the scenes that took a little longer to get to Edge, or sometimes Edge would have an issue and it wouldn't get updated at all. And we had to work really closely with Sitecore's support to get those things resolved. It was a problem at the beginning, but it's less of a problem now. We haven't noticed it nearly as much lately. So I think that the product is maturing, right? It was relatively new. Sitecore's continuing to work on it, so I think we're seeing that maturation happen. But it's still early. I would still consider it a pretty new product, so I would still encourage you to have a contingency plan ready, assess your risk, right? Um, and incorporate appropriate monitoring. So if something happens, if there's an error with Experience Edge or it goes down or something like that, um, be have monitoring set up and work with Sitecore if necessary. If you're using like managed cloud, let's say, to alert your dev teams or your infrastructure teams or whomever, right, to those things, so you can be in the loop because you don't have a lot of visibility into that stuff, not nearly as much as you did. Adopt GraphQL early. So we talked about this when we kind of pivoted away from the CD servers and we were using Experience Edge instead. We wouldn't have been able to do that if we weren't using GraphQL. So whether you're planning on using Experience Edge or not, adopt GraphQL early. Start getting your teams that skill set, start getting them familiar with it because they're going to need it later. Um, and I'll talk about that when I say it's the future. But when all of this stuff comes together, it's really, really powerful. You've got Edge, which is serving all of your content, it's serving all of your media. It's doing it really, really quickly. And if you pair that, let's say, with Vercel, for instance, you have a completely SaaS infrastructure um, that's all in the cloud and it's all auto scaling. It's a really beautiful thing. It's beautifully simple. Um, but Edge is the future. I said this before Symposium, and Symposium only confirmed it even more. Um, but take a look at XM Cloud, take a look at Content Hub 1, right? Both of those things use Experience Edge. So Edge isn't going away. Edge is the future of what we are going to be doing and using as software developers that work on Sitecore. So it's here to stay, don't get me wrong, and it is definitely the future. So adopt GraphQL early, get ready for Experience Edge. But ultimately, depending on where you're at in your project or in your organization, and how soon you plan on adopting it, just assess your appetite for risk. Okay, so finally, how'd all this perform, right? What are the end results? What did this thing look like when it was in the wild? So happy to show that we had a pretty significant performance increase. So on the left, we had the old website, the old Lighthouse scores, and on the right, we have the new results using Experience Edge and Next.js and Vercel. So on the left, we had 59 as performance, which honestly isn't terrible. I think we've all seen worse. It's not great, but it's not bad. And now we're up to a 98. And this is on our menu page. If you just click on the menu and you want to see all the stuff, which needs to be quick, right? If you think about it from a customer's point of view, if I'm hungry, I want to see things quickly, and ultimately it's going to lead to money for the business. So our first contentful prints down to less than a second, time to interactive 1.8, speed index 1.2. So a pretty significant increase there. On our homepage, often the first place that people land, right, needs to be quick. Went from a 52 to a 99, where we're at first contentful print in a third of a second, and time to interactive at just a second. So the performance has been great there. And then finally, our product details. So if I'm viewing the details of a product, again, I'm really close to maybe adding it to my basket, up to a 91 with a first contentful print of less than half a second. And then finally, the other thing to notice here is our build times also went down. So because we're consuming that Sitecore content at build time while the site is being generated, Vercel is making calls out to Experience Edge to get that content so that the pages can be pre-rendered. And because it's so much quicker, we noticed an 11% decrease in our build time, which, depending on what provider you have, directly correlates to cost. So if your Sitecore content can come back quicker, you can save money in the amount of build time, which is pretty cool too. All right, so the question that a lot of people have, right, is Experience Edge right for me? Um, Before Symposium, I gave a talk about, how you need to assess your risk, and depends on your project, depends on your timeline, the typical technical developer answer, right? And those things are still true in the near term, but in the long term, is Edge right for you? Uh, yes, it is, ultimately, because you really don't have a choice. If you want to use XM Cloud, if you want to use Content Hub 1, you're going to use Experience Edge. That's really all there is to it. But it's a great, powerful thing when things come together. But if you're looking to adopt it really soon, especially if you're not using XM Cloud and not using Content Hub 1, which most people aren't yet, I think it's worth still just, you know, assessing your risk, assessing your situation, talking about your project and what risks you're willing to take on. Finally, a couple helpful resources here. If you want to learn more about Jamstack, what it is, kind of the origins, what some of the underlying principles are, those two websites at the top are really helpful. That third one down is the restrictions and limitations of Experience Edge, really helpful. And then I know the bottom one says it's the Experience Edge connector, but it actually has a really good graphic about how publishing works in Experience Edge now. So it goes through all the steps, and I found that really helpful too. So with that, I want to thank all of you again for taking the time this evening to come and listen to my talk about Edge, and thank you so much for having me. And I will open it up to any questions that you all might have.
Thanks, Jeff. And we have one question. So from the chat window, can you take note?
Yes. Yeah, so how will personalization work in this architecture? So personalization is something that we're looking at right now. We haven't nailed down exactly what that's going to look like yet. Um, you have a couple different options. So you've got Sitecore technologies like um, Sitecore Personalize that you could use. You have non-Sitecore technologies like, Optimizely, let's say, that you could use, or Firebase or Google AB that you could use. But there's also a lot of those also come with the price of performance. So what we're trying to do is do performance at the edge, which is something that Sitecore is working on. So you can run those personalization conditions at the edge, and you can maintain performance. So there are a bunch of different ways you can tackle it. It just depends on kind of what's right for you. Experience Edge is a CDN, same as Vercel. Do you really see a lot of benefits? Uh, yeah, I would say you do. Um, and did you run into a double cache purging issue? No, we didn't run into a double cache purging issue at all with that, because Vercel's, I mean, I guess if you want to call statically generating things a cache, you kind of can, but there really wasn't any caching like that on the Vercel side that we ran into with Experience Edge. And with Experience Edge, you don't have to use Vercel by any means. You can use whatever you want. So being able to serve your content really quickly is beneficial. And remember that in our architecture, we weren't just powering websites; we were also powering mobile apps. So that's also where we saw the benefit. Is Vercel took care of a lot of the heavy lifting. Really, it's Next.js, right? But Vercel and Next.js took care of a lot of the heavy lifting on the web. But Experience Edge really helped us on native mobile apps when we were getting content there, because we didn't have Vercel sitting in the middle.
Anyone have any questions? So you can mention chat and raise your hand also.
So how are restrictions and in-session things? I'm not sure I understand your question there on the in-session restrictions. And feel free
And
to.
can you demo user
Yes, sir.
restriction?
All right, thank you. Thank you for meeting me here. So Jeff is just kind of question that how the user restrictions will work in the CDN kind of thing. For example, we have multiple type of users with different permissions. And since we are using this as a capture copy of the page, so how it's going to be work?
Yeah, so if you've got different users that need different levels of access to different things, um, that's an interesting one. So in Sitecore, publishing restrictions and workflow are going to be your friends. But if you're talking like outside of that and using your application for those kinds of things, then yeah, you're going to have to implement something slightly different. I'm not sure off the top of my head how that would work. I'd need to think about it a little bit more. Um, if it's something outside of Sitecore.
Okay, no issue. I'm basically learning those things as well. So
Yeah.
the one question regarding this XM Cloud and the experience is, do you think there will be any option available that we need to choose uh, this, or it's compulsory to use the experiences with the XM Cloud?
Um, so I don't work for Sitecore, so take it with a grain of salt. But everything that I've seen is it's Experience Edge.
Correct.
There's no
Okay.
option. Yeah, Experience Edge, as far as I'm aware, it just comes with XM Cloud. It comes with Content Hub 1, and that's how content gets served. Another question here. So Experience Edge will serve all the API requests, right? No, it won't. Experience Edge is just serving your Sitecore content. That's all it's doing. So when you make a request to get Sitecore content, that's where Experience Edge comes in. But if I need to make an API call to a third-party service to, I don't know, update a contact in my CRM, that doesn't go through Experience Edge. That would go through a custom API that you write, or maybe a middleware.
So Jeff, yeah, basically suppose if we are requesting for any sitecode content, then those requests will go to Experience Edge.
That's correct.
Okay, if we need any filtered data, like there is any data which we need to filter out based on some from Solar, suppose from Solar search. So Experience Edge will filter out that data from Solar and then provide the response. Is it?
Good question. There is a search endpoint, I believe, that you can still use. I'm not sure if that goes through Experience Edge or not. I think it does, because I think you're using a GraphQL query. At the end of the day, you're using a GraphQL query to search. So I think it does. We didn't have search for ours, so I can't tell you with 100% certainty, but I'm pretty sure you just use the GraphQL search query, and that would, at the end of the day, still hit Experience Edge
Okay,
because
okay.
it has
And
all of your items there.
got it. And it is mandatory to use Solar only for search. We can't use Covio or any other search framework.
Yeah, I mean, that's the only one that it supports. I think like for Coveo, for example, like, that crawls, I mean, that's just crawling your site and it's crawling your items. So I think you still could use Coveo, and I'm sure you could still use like, search stacks if you wanted, I'm guessing.
Mm.
But the only one that Sitecore is going to kind of support out of the box, right, is Solar. Like it's not going to support Azure Search or something like that. But it depends on the way that your search provider functions. If it's just doing like an HTML crawl, for example, and it's indexing that, then it shouldn't matter because it's already rendered and it's kind of abstracted away. So I think it depends.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Mhm.
And one more quick thing, like how the that analytics or tracking will be handling.
Yeah, so for us, we had analytics. and we had the analytics snippets that were on the site. So we really didn't notice any difference there. We weren't using Sitecore Analytics. We were using just Google Analytics. So nothing really changed for us there. We had the script on the page. We would push custom events on the client side. None of that really changed for us.
And for Sitecore Analytics, like that same tracking we are using, like same in the way we have visitor contacts and everything to track visitor ID.
Oh yeah, so for us we were using Sitecore XM, so we didn't have all of the analytics involved. But with like XM Cloud, that does have analytics and it does have some personalization in it. So I'm sure Sitecore still has a way that you can do it. I'm guessing it's just it's just a tag, like a snippet that you put in your JavaScript. I'm sure Sitecore has something like that.
Okay, thank you.
We also have one last question. I think it is similar that Kushan has asked.
Yeah, is there a way to integrate a third-party search service, or Solar is the only option? No, I'm granted I haven't done it, but I'm pretty confident you're not only limited to Solar. So if you wanted to use, Algolia or Covea or a different whatever search that you want, I'm sure you could still do it. It's just Solar is the only one that Sitecore is, supporting out of the box with Experience Edge. Also depends, like I mentioned, kind of on how that search service is implemented at the end of the day. Yeah, exactly. With XM Cloud, you've got Sitecore Search. But yeah, I'm sure you're going to have search stacks and other things too.
Any other question?
One quick thing, Jeff. So as we remove all the CD server and everything like load balancer, CD server, that is no longer required. So everything is published on Experience Edge. Now, is there any pricing difference? Like if we save some money by reducing those server, CD server and all, and it might be increase some pricing for that Experience Edge, like to have CD and sure.
I can't comment on pricing. Yeah, that would have to be something you talk to Sitecore about. I can't comment on pricing. I wouldn't want to lead you astray one direction or another. I'm not sure.
And in your project, you have only single CM server or like multiple CM server?
Just a single CM.
Okay.
Yeah, we have 5 Sitecore environments total, but a single CM in each one.
Okay.
Yep.
I think we are done with the questions. So thank you so much, Jeff, and for this wonderful presentation, and that was very helpful for all of us. And as you mentioned that you are available on the Sitecore community in case of any question in future. And
Yep.
thanks everyone for joining this session. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Thanks, guys.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Have a good weekend.